Okay, there we go. So we are recording. Well, welcome everybody to the Ocean County Historical Society's temporarily virtual speaker series. As our regulars know, we usually host these at our museum in Toms River, but it's been quite some time since we've been able to do that due to the pandemic. So we are now online. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Melissa Ziobro, and I am a trustee of the Historical Society. I happen to be hosting these events for now, but a lot of people help out with the logistics. So let me thank our president, Dr. Jeffrey Schenker, and some other trustees who made today's event possible, namely Barbara Roish and Richard and Mickey Kuntz. Now, just a few housekeeping announcements that I always have to make while I have a captive audience here before we dive into today's program. Please note that today's program is being recorded and will be available for playback on our YouTube channel in case you are more comfortable keeping your camera off or anything. We just want you to be aware of that. Today's speaker series, like so many of our events, is free, but we do rely on your donations to keep us going and to continue our mission telling the stories of Ocean County. We'd like you to know that you can donate from the safety and convenience of your own home via our website, oceancountyhistory.org. You can also sign up to be a member there. Perks include our award-winning newsletter, early registration and discounts on some programs, and more, all of which is outlined on our beautiful website, which again is oceancountyhistory.org. Please know that we are open, our museum and our research room. They are both open now. You can find the hours and all other necessary information like safety and health protocols on our website. I'd also like to remind you that we are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So please follow us on the platform of your choice or on all of them. Our next lecture after today will be September 19th at 2 p.m. That's by Rick Gefkin, who's currently heading up a project called the New Jersey Slave Records Index, and he'll be talking to us about the history of slavery in New Jersey. Another exciting event I'd like to tell you about is Ocean County History Day, which is coming up on Sunday, September 12th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. It'll be held on the grounds of the Historical Society at 26 Hadley Avenue, and it will have music and food and displays, not just from the Ocean County Historical Society, but from a number of other historical societies and museums throughout the county. So you'll definitely want to get there. It'll be a fun day for the entire family. You can find additional details on our website and social media. So with those announcements out of the way, on to today's event. Chris Crosby is a PhD student in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University, and he'll be telling us about the coyotes that arrived in New Jersey about 80 years ago and can now be found in almost every town across the state. In the past 2 years, coyotes have immigrated to Barnegat Light, reproduced, and are dispersing across Long Beach Island. So you'll learn a little bit about the history of the coyotes, their ecology and behavior, and important guidance for avoiding negative human-coyote interactions. So with all that, I will hand it off to you, Chris.
Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate being here today. Thanks for you guys having me. As Melissa mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Rutgers. I'm also a part of the Rutgers Cooperative Extension, which allows me to do things like this, to reach out and speak to the public on subjects such as this. So I'll share my screen now to go to the slideshow, and we'll start the presentation.
That's it. Oh, look at all the names.
We don't want to see all those people, do we?
We don't want to see them.
Coyotes in New Jersey.
All right, turn it up. I've got the
Just a
sound.
reminder to go ahead and make sure you are muted, please, if you are not speaking. I also have the power of the mute button here, but if you just came in from the waiting room, please try to make sure you're muted. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
All right, thank you, Melissa. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking, or as Melissa mentioned, we're going to be talking about coyotes of New Jersey. My name is Chris Crosby. I put this presentation together with the help of Kathleen Kerwin and our boss, Dr. Brooke Maslow. We're all part of the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to cover first how coyotes got to New Jersey. Then we're going to move into coyote ecology and behavior. We'll talk about how Rutgers documents coyotes and a little bit about how other universities and research teams document coyotes here in New Jersey. And we're also going to talk about how to avoid conflicts with coyotes. They're very rare, and we can make them even rarer by following a few simple guidelines. So first, we're going to talk about how did coyotes get to New Jersey? And I think for question purposes, it might be best just for me to stop after each section, and then we'll just open it up to some questions, and then I'll move on to the next section after that. So I'll pause and ask for questions after this section. Here's a map of coyotes and their ranges over different time periods across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The dark orange part of the map shows their historical range, where they were before human expansion across North America. And as the colors get lighter, it shows their expansions in more recent years. And as you can see, they took a couple of different routes to get to the East Coast, namely the northern one that went through the Great Lakes region, and then they went through the Southeast as well a little bit later. And so why did coyotes expand their range in the late 1800s? What drove them to expand their range? There's two things we can really point to that caused this range expansion. The first being large-scale deforestation, which was coupled with the increase in agriculture. As more people were spreading across the country, we needed more food. So we cut down forests and converted those forests into fields for agriculture and livestock ranging. And then along with that, people who were farming wanted the removal of large predators from the landscape. So things like wolves, bears, and mountain lions were targeted by the government of all three countries, citizens in these countries, and non-governmental organizations. They worked really hard to remove things like grizzly bears, gray wolves, mountain lions. And this lack of other predators on the landscape allowed for the coyote to have the freedom to move about. Because in a head-to-head competition where a coyote is trying to live in an area where there are mountain lions living in that area, the mountain lion will win every time. But when you remove the mountain lion or the bear or the wolf from the area, the coyote has the ability to move into that area. And so during this expansion across the country, we have, back in the 1800s, we had in Western North America, we had what we called the Western coyote. It's a little bit smaller and more used to wide open ranges than the Eastern coyote we have today. And there's a couple of things that led to their slight change over the last 150 years to give us what we now call the Eastern coyote. And that first thing that caused that change was during the eradication of gray wolves from a lot of parts of North America, there'd be individual gray wolves who were looking for a mate to mate with, and they found no other gray wolves in the landscape. And due to the close proximity of gray wolves, dogs, and coyotes on the tree of life, they're pretty closely related to each other. They're all able to breed successfully with each other and produce hybrids. And so you have a lot of coyotes moving eastward during the late 1800s, early 1900s. You have a dwindling population of gray wolves, and the combination of those two things made it so gray wolves would seek out coyotes to breed with. This also occurred with domestic dogs in the same matter. As coyotes moved into a new area that was inhabited by humans, there would be domestic dogs in that area. And the domestic dogs and coyotes would also breed. So you have this kind of mixture, or what we call introgression, of gray wolf DNA and domestic dog DNA into the coyote population. And that led to a slight change in the coyote, creating the Eastern coyote, which is a slightly larger, slightly more used to human populations because of that dog DNA. And they're also better adapted to living in forested areas than they were in the western part of the country. So what we have now is called a Eastern coyote. But that history that I just explained leads to a lot of people using the terms coy wolf and coy dog. These are incorrect terms. They're pretty misleading, and they cause a little bit of panic because the term coy wolf leads people to believe that they're these large, hulking, man-eating beasts out in the woods waiting to find them. The fact of the matter is they're about 35 to 40 pounds, about the size of a Cocker Spaniel. They don't really want to get anywhere near humans. They don't want to deal with us at all. They're just kind of here because they have nowhere else to go. And Eastern coyote is the correct term. We found that that term leads to the least amount of incorrect panic from the public. And then a little bit more specific about them getting to New Jersey. The first sighting was in 1939 in Lambertville up in Hunterdon County. The first confirmed report wasn't until 9 years later in Cape May County, 1948. And then into the mid to late 50s, they started popping up in the northern part of New Jersey. And over the last 80 or so years, they've moved into pretty much every municipality in the state. And so here is a map of, here's a map of New Jersey put together by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection from July of 2016. And so this is a heat map showing with darker red colors showing where there's a higher concentration of coyote sightings. And they used a few different ways to get these numbers. They used harvest reports because coyotes are game species. They are hunted and trapped legally here in New Jersey. They used roadkill. So if a coyote was hit by a car, it's usually reported to the DEP, and they include that in these numbers. And they also use sightings. So if someone called in and reported they had a coyote in their backyard, they would include that in this count. And as of 2016, which is 5 years ago, 96% of New Jersey had a coyote sighting in it, and that's by land area. So every municipality had a sighting, but 96% of the state had sightings in it. And as you can see, the densest parts of the state where it comes to coyotes are the Pine Barrens, or for Ocean County specifically, the western part of Ocean County is pretty dense with coyotes. And then northwest New Jersey, up in Sussex County, is a pretty big coyote hotspot as well. So that was pretty quick, just covering how they got here. If there's any questions, I'd like to answer them now before we move on to the coyote ecology and behavior, if you guys have any.
You should all have the ability to unmute yourselves. You're welcome to do that and ask Chris a question, or if you'd like to type it in the chat, I'd be happy to read it for you.
Yes, hi, this is Connie. I had actually heard, and I'm not sure if this was true, that that the coyotes came over, as you mentioned, those particular years, and it was also as a result of they were coming through Pennsylvania when the Delaware River froze. That's how they actually started traversing into New Jersey. Is that true?
It could be true. It could very well be true. They do use, they have the ability to walk on frozen water pretty easily. That's, we're gonna talk about a little bit later. We're gonna talk about how they got out to LBI. One of the thoughts is maybe they used a year where there was a frozen bay. But they also are just as happy using bridges. So it sounds a little ridiculous, but they will walk over any bridge anytime, middle of the night, and they will take the bridge over the Delaware River. So it could have just as easily been that as anything else.
If they be told.
Chris,
Yes.
I was wondering if there's any difference in eating behavior of the coyotes and the wolves and the domestic dogs when they're interbreeding and so forth. Do they all feed the same way? Are you covering?
I'll cover that in this section a little bit. We'll cover diet. Wolves are primarily more interested in killing and taking a prey item that they killed, whereas coyotes, we consider them more as a scavenger. They will hunt small mammals like squirrels and rabbits and things like that, but they also are pretty good at scavenging carcasses. Trash here in New Jersey is a pretty big one for them, and any kind of carrion they can find. And domestic dogs are similar to coyotes in their diet. If you leave a domestic dog to get feral, it'll kind of revert to eating carrion and any kind of trash it can find as well as in some cases hunting small mammals. But
Thanks.
wolves primarily are predators. They'll go after something that's alive and try to take it down and eat that.
They probably like to roll. Too.
Okay. If there's no more questions, I'll move on to ecology and behavior. So for this section, I like to start off with just a quick rundown of the description of coyotes, because there's, as you can imagine, there are a lot of reports or calls we get from the public, and they say, hey, there's a coyote in my backyard, and we do a little bit of investigating. We find out it's either a dog that got out of someone's backyard, or it's a red fox, or it's a gray fox, the other two wild canids that are here in New Jersey. So I like to start this section off by just describing a coyote, giving a good picture of what they look like, and that seems to help people kind of get an idea of what to look for when they're seeing coyotes. And so we'll start off in the top left, just with weight. As I mentioned, males are about 30 to 45 pounds. Females are slightly smaller, 26 to 40 pounds. Coyotes have these large pointed ears on top of their head, similar to that of a German Shepherd. They have these bright yellow eyes, and if you get close enough to see the yellow eyes, you're going to see a lot of the other things I'm going to describe here. For size, they're about 3 to 4.5 feet long. That's not including the tail, which is another like 18 inches long. And they're about 2 feet tall at the shoulder. They come in a lot of different colors, which leads to a lot of the confusion. Predominantly, they're what we see here, which we call a gray. That gray is caused by fur banding, which is the combination of a bunch of different fur colors all close together. So if you look closely, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but here on the back, you can see there are kind of lines of black coinciding with lines of white and lines of tan. If you looked really closely at a coyote's fur, you'd see that there are individual hairs right next to each other, and they're all black, gray, silver, brown, and the combination of all that from a distance makes them look gray predominantly. But they do also come in different morphs. That's the word we use, morphs. They come in black, brown, blonde. We'll actually have a good picture of a blonde coyote later in the presentation. And the best way to tell a coyote, for me at least, has always been the tail. They have, this is not a great picture, but we have some great pictures later. They have a drooping, bushy tail, and they always have a black tip to their tail. No matter what color phase they're in, that tip of the tail is always going to be black, and it's always going to be drooping, similar to that of a dog that's just been scolded. They're going to have it between their legs, kind of, and that even when they're running full speed, they're going to have that tail between their legs, which is a good indicator that you're looking at a coyote. And as I mentioned, there are two other canids here in New Jersey, the red fox, which is on the top right, and the gray fox, which is on the bottom left. The red fox is way more common in New Jersey than the gray fox, so we'll start with that. It's about a third the size of a coyote, roughly 12 pounds. And the big stark difference between these two is color. You're not going to see really a coyote with discoloration of this bright orange kind of red fur. Red foxes also are distinguished by those little socks they have on their feet. I like to call them socks, but it's the black fur they have on all four of their feet. And while they have a big bushy tail that also kind of droops a little bit, the big distinguisher here is they have that white tip on the tail. And red foxes come in a lot of different phases as well. They can come in a gray phase, black phase, and that leads to a lot of confusion with them, between them, coyotes and gray foxes. But in all phases, the red fox has that white tip to the tail. So that's a good way to tell what you're looking at. If you can get your eyes on the tail, that's usually a good way to indicate what canid you're looking at. And here on the bottom left is the smallest of the three, the gray fox. They're what we call an arboreal species. They live in trees, if you can believe that. They climb up trees a lot. They're significantly smaller than even the red fox. And the issue with them is they have a very similar coat pattern to that of a coyote. So if you see one in the woods, you might consider it a coyote. But the easiest way I can tell you is they have kind of like a cat-like face to them because they're so small. And again, they're going to be up in a tree usually, or around a tree, and in the denser forested parts of New Jersey. And they're significantly smaller than both other canids. So that's usually the best way to tell between the two, between that and a coyote. Okay, now on to diet and feeding. We like to use the term opportunistic omnivore when we talk about coyotes. They pretty much will eat whatever they can get their paws on. And this list is by no means exhaustive, but it's a good highlight list of things that they do enjoy going after and eating. On the top here, we have a picture of a coyote with a squirrel in its mouth. They do a good job of cleaning up rodent and rabbit populations. If you have a pest rodent or rabbit population in your yard, if a coyote moves into the area, that pesky population will not be around for long. There's a lot of talk about coyotes and their effects on the deer population. Here in New Jersey, they don't exhibit that much of a pack hunting behavior. Coyotes don't. So that you're not going to see a pack of coyotes really work together to take down a large adult deer. If a coyote does take out a deer, it's going to be either a young or an injured deer. Usually that's not going to have that much effect on the deer population here in New Jersey. They will also resort to eating things like insects and frogs. They'll go after other predators like raccoons. They'll even go after red foxes, feral cats, things like that. And the picture here in the middle, that coyote is eating a apple from an apple tree. They will happily survive off of fruits and nuts. So if you have a fruit tree or a nut tree in your yard and it's dropping fruit occasionally, that will be a good source of a diet for a coyote. They're also really good at getting eggs from ground nesting birds, things like wood ducks. And on the coast, we have a lot of issues with coyotes eating things like plovers and American oyster catchers. And as I mentioned earlier, garbage is a good source of food for these animals. This is my favorite picture in the entire presentation. This guy in the bottom right has about half of a pizza. He's going to have himself a very good night. Looks like it's got some pepperoni on it. It's going to be delicious. But that's also a great source of food for coyotes. We have coyote populations in a lot of urban areas now. Up in the Bronx and in Central Park in New York City, they have healthy coyote populations, and most of them are surviving off of not only rats, but things like trash they can find good source of food in. And another major thing, not as big of an issue here in New Jersey, but in some parts of New Jersey it is, livestock. They will go after things like chickens, ducks, even small sheep they'll take out. And young coyotes will see that as kind of like a training opportunity for hunting small mammals, because the animals in livestock pens are trapped. They can't get out of the pen. The coyote works its way into the pen and it has free reign to kill and eat whatever it can find in there. So pretty much when we think about coyotes, we like to think of them as eating whatever they can get their hands on. It's why they're so good at living in a lot of different places. As for reproductive biology, so breeding season for them, when mated pairs come together and copulate, is usually between January and March. Their gestation period is just over 60 days. So about 2 months after the pair comes together, they'll have a litter of pups. Pairs, so a male and a female usually bond, and they can form pairs that last the life of the mates. This is less of a romantic thing and more of a convenience thing. A lot of times coyotes are trapped into an area where they have to remain for a long period of time, just because they can't expand their territory outside of their area for a multitude of reasons. And that leads to the same male and female meeting up every year to reproduce. Coyotes do not form large packs, as I mentioned. So if you see a group of coyotes, it's not really a pack of non-related animals. It's usually a social unit consisting of the male and female of that mated pair, as well as the young of the year. So you'll have juvenile coyotes, especially this time of year, going around with mom and dad and kind of learning the ropes. Like other canids, they sleep in dens, and they den when they are breeding, especially. So things like hollowed out trees, underneath decks. They'll also take over burrows from smaller animals like groundhogs or red foxes, kick those animals out, and then expand the den to be of a greater size for them. Average size of a litter for coyotes is about 47 pups. We have a picture here of, I think there's 5 pups in that picture. And that combined with the fact that these coyotes can live for about 10 to 14 years leads to their ability to be so reproductively proficient. They can reproduce really fast, and that can lead to them kind of exploding in an area and taking over that area really, really quickly. Which is why we saw them expand so quickly across the United States after we took out things like wolves and bears and mountain lions. During the weaning period, both sexes provide food for the juveniles back at the den. The male and the female will both go off and hunt and bring back solid food when the pups are old enough to chew on solid food. And then late in the summer, around this time, the pups will, as I mentioned, begin going out with mom and dad, learning how to hunt. And then eventually in the early fall, mom and dad will kick the pups out of the den, and the pups will have to go off and fend for themselves. And that's usually when you start seeing coyotes pop up in people's backyards where they weren't before, because you have new adults that are just trying to figure out where they're going, and they're trying to see if these areas, namely people's backyards, are acceptable places for them to be. And we'll talk about a little bit later how you can make it so it's not an acceptable place if you don't want it to be. Okay, here's a little sad slide, but we're going to talk about what kills coyotes. So the Urban Coyote Research Project put this together. It's a combination of 281 radio-collared coyotes from 2000 to 2014. So it's a bunch of different studies that they put together, known causes of death, and they combined it to make this chart. The first thing that should pop out to you is that big red bar. About 42.5% of coyote deaths are caused by vehicle strikes. And so that is really because coyotes are pretty wide-ranging in their movements. They're a rather large animal, and so that means they need a pretty large area to walk around to find all the resources they need. And so especially in an urban area or urban areas like New Jersey where there's a lot of roads, that leads to an animal crossing a lot of streets all the time during its everyday life. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of vehicle strikes, because mostly these animals moving at night, and unfortunately, they're going to be crossing a street when someone's, going 35, 40 miles an hour on a back road, and they're not going to have time to stop before they hit the animal. So most coyote deaths are caused by vehicle strikes. Second, I did mention that they are game species, so about 20% are shot. Even trapped coyotes, usually the way that they are killed is by being shot by a .22. And then the last one on the left there, disease. Coyotes do succumb to diseases such as mange and canine distemper, and those can actually be pretty detrimental to a coyote population and reduce the numbers on a landscape pretty quickly. And then the other chunk of data was either other or unknown. So ecological significance, coyotes can be seen a lot as a pest. A lot of people don't want them in their area, but really they are pretty helpful in a lot of ways. They help fill the role of the extirpated wolf that used to be here in New Jersey a few hundred years ago. So as I mentioned earlier, they can help control rodent and rabbit populations, and they do take some deer, but that has little impact on deer numbers, as we mentioned. And as I mentioned, coyotes kill and sometimes eat things we call mesopredators. So a mesopredator is an animal that is not the top of the food chain. We use the term apex predator when we're talking about the animal that is numero uno on the food chain. So that's the coyote here in New Jersey. But things below that that still hunt other animals, things like foxes, raccoons, and feral cats, we call those things mesopredators. And so coyotes can actually perform a service by controlling the populations of those mesopredators in an area. So the example I like to use is if you have, I don't know, let's say you have 5 square miles of land and you have, 3 or 4 red foxes in that area and a few raccoons in that area. If a coyote moves into that 5 square mile land area and starts roaming that area consistently, the fox and the raccoons are no longer going to feel comfortable in that area just because the coyote is bigger and stronger and will kick them out. And so rather than having a few fox and a few raccoons roaming that area constantly, taking out things like songbirds, shorebirds, and turtles, sometimes these animals are already in low numbers that they're having issues staying around at all. If a coyote moves into the area, it can actually reduce the pressure overall on the prey populations in that area and kind of help the prey population rebound. And so that's part of the research we're looking at here on the coast of New Jersey, is looking at if coyotes moving into an area is actually helping shorebird populations or hindering it. So far, the jury is still out, and I'll let you know when we get definitive answers, but that's a few years down the road, I think. Okay, that's it for ecology and behavior. If we have any questions, which I imagine we probably do, that's a lot of information all at once, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, my name is Catherine, and I have 2 questions. The gray fox, where is that primarily located?
So here in New Jersey, it's in more forested areas. Northwestern New Jersey, up near the Appalachians, is more so where it's concentrated. You're not going to see it in southern Jersey as much, if at all.
All right, thank you. And my second question, a lot of times animals in the dark, when your headlights hit them, they're of a different color. Does the same thing happen with the yellow eyes of the coyote?
Yeah, there's I forget what it's called, but there's in lots of animals that move around at night, there's a lens in their eye that causes the light in your headlight or any flashlight or whatever to reflect. So that's why when you're out in the woods at night and you have a flashlight, you might only see the glowing eyes of some of these predators, which leads a lot of people to be afraid, but it can be something as small as a gray fox or a feral cat. But yeah, all those animals generally have that reflection back that causes that kind of glowing eye, and coyotes are no exception.
So what would be color their eyes in the night? Silver? Silverish?
Kind of whatever light is being shined at them. It's not really a color so much as just the reflection of the light back at you.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll move on to studying New Jersey coyotes. This is where we're going to get a little bit more into the Ocean County specific stuff. We're going to start off first with the simple ways we document canids here in New Jersey. So before I started doing work here in New Jersey, a different researcher by the name of Dr. Michelle Stanchel, she did her PhD work looking at predators out on the coast in a different aspect than what I'm doing. But she did a very simple but very effective tracking project, and where she would go around to different beaches throughout the summer each year and look for canid tracks and try to determine what kind of predators are living in each of these areas. And so she did that from 2015 to 2017. And because all these animals are walking around in these areas, they all leave behind their tracks. And if you know how to tell the difference between the tracks, you can tell which animal has been in which area and which predators you need to worry about. And so I like to start out with these 3 pictures up on the top left, just to describe what you might see out in the woods or on the beach if you're walking along, and it might help you identify what kind of animals are in your area. So first, I like to start off with a domestic dog. We're all familiar with domestic dog prints. Even if you don't have a dog, you've definitely seen a dog print somewhere. And the best way I can describe the difference between a domestic dog and the wild canids here in New Jersey, their footprints, is the domestic dog has a more splayed out, boxy shape to their footprint. I like to imagine it as if you were to put your hand in the sand or some wet mud and you spread out your fingers, that would be the dog print. Whereas if you put your fingers all together and create more of an arrowhead shaped print, that would be the coyote and the red fox. You can see in the picture here, the coyote and the red fox have a more pointed shape to their paws. That is true pretty much except for a couple of different domestic dog species. The difference is there for all of them. So if you see pointed toes, and especially those two front claws that are kind of pointed ahead, you can see really well in this red fox picture. That usually means it's a wild canid, a coyote or red fox. And the way we tell the difference between a coyote and a red fox generally is based on size. As I mentioned, coyotes are about 3 times the size of a red fox. And because of that difference in size, their paws are also about 3 times the size of the red fox paws. Now, if you have an extremely large red fox or a very small coyote, you can kind of muddy the waters, and that it can be confusing a little bit. So beyond that, the way we tell the difference, and this is only if we have extremely defined prints, is because of the larger negative space created by hair in red fox prints. So the red foxes, unlike coyotes and some breeds of domestic dog, they have hair in between all their toes and the pad of their foot. That creates a larger negative space or a lack of a print in between the pad of the foot and the front toes. And if you have a really good print, either in snow or really wet sand, compared to the coyote print, you can tell the difference, but it's extremely hard. So we usually just go based off of size. And down here on the bottom left is a chart I pulled from one of Dr. Stanchel's papers. So she just published this one last year. And it's just, I like to point this out just as a baseline for what we were seeing in Barnegat Light before 2018. And so this is a count. These charts are just counts of how many tracks she encountered over the 3 years of 2015, 2016, 2017 in these 3 areas. The 3 areas I circled are Barnegat Light. I circled Cape May because it's in the middle, but you can ignore that bar. And then Holgate here. And as you can see, Barnegat Light and Holgate had very little to no coyote presence before 2018. So we know, based off of Michelle's work, there really weren't any coyotes on LBI at that time. Now, we're going to get into what I've been doing over the last couple of years and how we know that might have changed. So what we do now with my lab and what we do out in the field is we leave cameras attached to things like trees or on stakes out on the beach. We leave them for about a month. And these cameras are what we call game cameras, or people that hunt or trap. They use them to find where animals are moving around in their area. We use them as a research purpose. We put them on trees and we put a lure and some bait on the ground in front of them. And the lure we use is called Caven's Gusto. It's a long distance predator lure used by fur trappers. It's very successful at getting animals in the area to come check out what's in a closer proximity to the camera. And so what we do is we place the camera on the tree. We set it up to be pretty sensitive. So if something walks by, that causes the camera to take a picture. And then we put the lure on the ground in front of it. And so that draws in things like red foxes, raccoons, and coyotes to come check out the smell. And when they walk in front of the camera, we get a good picture of what's out there. And this is how we can determine when and where there are coyotes and red fox and raccoons in coastal areas here in New Jersey. So we've been doing that since January of 2019. And that is when we got our first picture to our knowledge of a coyote on LBI. So this is that coyote from January 2019. It was in the marsh area near the lighthouse. So starting in April of 2019, we started a monthly camera rotation within 3 separate areas of LBI, which I believe are the only parts of Ocean County. Oh, we also do Island Beach State Park, but there are no coyotes in Island Beach State Park. The only part of Ocean County that has coyotes on the coast that I'm aware of is LBI. So the 3 areas I'm going to talk about are High Bar Harbor, which for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a map of LBI. This is High Bar Harbor up here circled in red. It's just behind Barnegat Light State Park in the bay. It's a little spit of land. We also have cameras in Barnegat Light State Park. And then we have a lot of cameras down in the Holgate unit of the Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, down at the southern end of the island. And so from April of 2019 through March of 2020, we monitored those 3 areas with cameras. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we had a camera out there. And so as you can imagine, we had a lot of pictures taken. Not all of them were useful. A lot of them were just grass moving in the picture frame or people coming up to mess with the cameras. But we were able to see coyotes, red foxes, and take counts of each species and see how often they're there. And so this chart I've produced shows the coyotes and red foxes that were present on LBI during that time. And just as a way to explain what's going on in the chart, I'm just going to go through it all real quick. So on the right here, we have the legend. The yellow bars signify the number of species that were occurring in the spring. The green signifies the summer, orange fall, and then the light blue is the winter. And so each bar represents a 3-month period of that season. On the left here, we have the y-axis, which is counting the number of distinct pictures of each animal. And then on the bottom here, we have the species and location combination. So the bars all the way to the left, they represent the coyotes we saw in Barnegat Light State Park. And the bar all the way to the right, that light blue bar, is the foxes we saw on Holgate. So now that we're all caught up, we're going to talk about a little bit of the differences between the two areas and the two species. So in High Bar Harbor, which for reference is that little spit of land here, we had pretty much no sightings of coyotes throughout the entire study. We had a full year, no pictures of coyotes except for the very end. We had 1 or 2 pictures of coyotes that popped in and then immediately left. We had plenty of pictures of red fox. Red fox loved High Bar Harbor. It seems there's a couple of resident foxes on that part of the island. But that also means that it looks like the foxes are avoiding the coyotes, because if you go over to Barnegat Light, which is a mile and a half away, we have no sightings of red fox except for, again, 1 sighting in the fall of 2019, where we think a juvenile red fox wandered into Barnegat Light State Park before it realized the place was inundated with coyotes. And as you can see from the chart, there are plenty of coyotes, or there were plenty of coyotes in Barnegat Light in the full year that we were monitoring. This is because there was a mated pair that took up residence in Barnegat Light State Park, and they produced these 3. These are the 3 coyote pups that lived in Barnegat Light State Park that summer. And this is one of the 2 sets of pictures I got of all 3 of them on the camera at the same time. And this is kind of a cool story. You can see the coyote numbers throughout the year, starting in the spring. There are not that many coyote numbers. As the year progresses, you get more coyote sightings, more coyote sightings. That's due to the pups showing up. And then you can see there's a slight fall in the winter when as we mentioned earlier, coyotes kick their young out around mid-fall. And the parents in Barnegat Light were no different. They kicked their young out, and the young had to go find a new place to live. Well, you see, if you look at the coyote numbers in Holgate, there are no coyotes in Holgate, that southern part of the island, any part of the spring or summer. No coyotes seen at all. And then in the fall, we saw this picture. And if we had a few different pictures of him, this is the best one. But if you got a good look at this coyote, he was definitely a younger coyote. And that is one of these 3 coyotes. After the summer has ended, they grew up, and one or two of them moved down to Holgate and found a wide open area with no humans to worry about and plenty of food resources. And as you can see, the number of coyote sightings in Holgate exploded. And during that winter, we had coyote pictures every day. They were very attracted to the cameras, and they liked the lure we were using. So we got plenty of pictures of coyotes. And so that was just a way we could see how coyotes were moving along LBI from the northern end to the southern end within the span of just 1 year. And as far as I'm aware, from people who are continuing to study the area and from our cameras we put out there occasionally since then, there are still coyotes on Holgate. I'm not sure about Barnegat Light. I think there still might be a few there, but I heard rumors that there was a trapper that went in there and removed some of them. And this led to a lot of headlines like this: coyote sightings on Long Beach Island. Police were notified. People were very concerned. And we're about to go into the how to avoid coyote-human conflict section. So this is a good transition. But before we go into that, I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions on any of that, because I know that was also a lot of information. Okay. We'll move on to how to avoid coyote-human conflict.
Chris,
Yes.
can I ask you what was attractive about Holgate to the coyotes, do you think? Did I miss that?
So I was more talking about they were attracted to our lure on the cameras, but
Yeah,
generally I think what's attractive to the coyotes in that area is just after walking the entire span of LBI where there's house after house after house, they found a pretty wide open area where they didn't have to worry about humans.
okay,
And as people who frequent LBI will know, during the summer, people aren't allowed out onto Holgate pretty much all summer long
breeding birds.
for the breeding birds, and the coyotes find that to be kind of a refuge. They can go out there, they can have a den,
okay.
they don't have to worry about anything, and also they can eat as many birds as they want. So it's a pretty good place for them to be.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question. Okay. How to avoid coyote-human conflict. So we like to start off by defining what an urban coyote is, because a lot of places in New Jersey have what we call urban coyotes. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily living in the Bronx or Central Park, but they're living in an area where there is a pretty decent number of humans, and they have to work to avoid human populations. And so we also like to point out that coyotes are most active between dusk and dawn. They're generally seen as nocturnal, but it is not necessarily abnormal to see them out during the day. So just like you or I would take an opportunity to get a quick, easy meal, a coyote, if it's sleeping in a bush or sleeping in a den somewhere and it sees a quick and easy opportunity to get a meal, even if it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's going to take that opportunity. So if you see a coyote out in the day like this picture shows, it's not necessarily meaning there's anything wrong with the animal. It just means that that animal is seeking an opportunity it saw to find an easy meal. And this, before I go on any farther, this is a great picture of more of a blondish coyote and has that drooping tail with that black tip. This coyote's in motion, but that tail continues to droop a bit. Just another way to tell when you're looking at an animal to figure out if it's a coyote or not. This is a great picture to show you that. And one last thing, direct coyote human interaction is extremely rare. They don't want to interact with us any more than they have to. Unless there is something wrong with that animal, which we'll cover here at the end, they're going to try to get away from you as soon as possible. They don't want to deal with you. They're just as scared of you are, if not more, than you are of them. Okay, so here are some indirect management strategies. So we like to say human behavior modification that will aid in not getting coyotes to either want to be in your area or continue to coming back to your area. So first, and if you take nothing else from this presentation, please take this: avoid feeding wildlife at all costs. It leads to what we like to call habituation, or their lost natural fear of people. So just like domestic dogs are born and they instantly recognize people as something that they instinctually want to live with and be associated with, wild animals are born with an inherent fear of people. They don't want to be near us. They don't want to deal with us. And only through continued habituation do they lose that fear. So if you have a trash pile, or you feed your dogs outside, or you have a compost bin that's easily accessible by some animals, those animals will continue to learn that your area is a very good area for them to get free food. And as they continue to find free food and no issues in that area, they'll keep coming back again and again until they have really no more fear of you. And now they associate you with food. And that's where we run into a lot of issues with these animals, is they start seeing people as their ticket to food. And then if that person stops feeding that animal, there can be some aggression on the animal's part towards that person, because now they're like, well, you were feeding me and now I'm not getting fed. What's going on? And they seek an aggressive route sometimes. And that's when some animals are put down. So ways that we can restrict potential food access: I mentioned garbage, I mentioned compost, I mentioned outdoor pet food. If you're feeding your animals outside, just make sure you're cleaning up after you feed them outside. Don't leave food out all night, because that can lead to an animal like a coyote or a raccoon finding that food, and then they will return. And then never leave small pets unattended. One of the big issues I hear about a lot in LBI now that there are coyotes there, people are worried about their small dogs or cats getting attacked by a coyote. And that's very rare. A coyote generally isn't going to go after an animal like that. It sees it as too much of a challenge. They don't want to get scratched and bit while they're trying to get their food. But it does happen occasionally. We have a picture on the next slide that'll show a coyote chasing a cat. And you just want to make sure that you're not leaving your animal unattended, because if a coyote is desperate enough for it, they will go after a cat. And usually this is not in an attempt to feed on the animal. They see cats and dogs as competition. So a coyote is trying to find small mammals like squirrels and rats and rabbits to eat. And in its brain, things like cats, which feral cats will go after those other animals, but also dogs, they see those as competition in their goal of getting more food, and they will go after those animals and try to kill them just to remove them from the area. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, they will prey on livestock like rabbits, sheep, chickens, and other small animals. And please keep cats inside. I know this is an issue for some people, but everyone agrees, even outside of academia, ASPCA, PETA, they all agree cats are happier and live longer while they're inside, and they won't, not only will they avoid getting eaten by a coyote or attacked by a coyote, they won't get diseases, they won't get hit by a car. It's just better for the animal overall. And as I mentioned, small dogs can also be targeted a little bit. So now we're going to move on to direct management strategies, negative stimuli, exclusion, and removal of animals. So the first negative stimuli we're going to talk about is hazing. So hazing is a term we use to talk about when you're trying to actively scare an animal from your area. So if you encounter a coyote and you don't want it in the area that it's in, it's important to not just leave or run away. You don't want that animal to think, okay, I'm here and they left, so now this is my area and I'm safe here. You want them to know that they are not welcome. And how you can do that is you can stand tall, stand your ground, wave your arms, shout, make a lot of noise. If that doesn't work to scare off the animal, you can pick up objects like sticks, balls, or rocks and throw them towards the animal. You don't want to throw them at the animal. You don't want to hit the animal. You don't want to injure the animal, but you want to throw it at them so they feel like they're being attacked and they leave the area. If you have a hose, if you're out gardening, spray the animal with the hose. Nothing like getting sprayed with a hose. And you just want to make sure that when you're doing all these things, you want to give the animal room to escape. Issues can arise when you are in a fenced-in area and you have a coyote in the backyard and you're trying to get it out of the area, but there's nowhere for the coyote to go. If it sees its only way of escape as through you, it will attack you to get out of the area. So if you're doing any of these hazing techniques, you want to make sure there's an easy way for the coyote to get out of the area so you don't cause any issues. Another negative stimuli that people look into are adversive conditioning and repellents. We get a lot of questions about these. People can buy motion sensing sprayers like are pictured here. You can buy motion sensing speakers that will play a really obnoxious noise to scare off the animal. We found that in the long term, these things tend to not work. Initially, the animal will be scared by either the spray or the scent or the sound or even just a flashing light. But after a while, the animal will realize, especially coyotes who are pretty smart, they'll realize that there's nothing bad happening after the bad smell or the bad noise or the bad light. And they will eventually, if there's still something in the area that they're trying to get after, they'll just walk by the thing and realize it's not going to hurt them. And then after that, you've bought some flashing light or some spraying thing that cost you a bit of money and now isn't doing anything except flashing a light in your backyard that's not doing anything. So we generally don't advise people to buy things like this because they don't always work. And if they do work, they usually don't work long term. So usually things like hazing and prevention are your best bet when you're trying to keep these animals out of your backyard. As for exclusion, coyotes can dig and climb. They're pretty capable of both. So if you're going to try to exclude a coyote or any animal from an area, you want to use a fence that is at least 5 to 6 feet high. You want to make sure you bury 6 inches underground and have 12, that should say 12 inches, not 12 feet. You should have 12 inches extending away from the fence underground outwards so the animal can't dig underneath near the fence. And then you want the last 12 to 18 inches on the top of the fence to canter outwards so the animal can't climb over, because coyotes and red fox can climb fences with their claws if they really want to. And then this can be pretty expensive, so it may only be practical around high value areas such as expensive gardens, or if you have some animals like livestock. This is something you might want to put up. Other forms of exclusion, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, coyotes and other animals will den underneath decks. So if you have an opening under your deck or your porch, or even underneath a shed, animal like a coyote will use that as a denning area if they see an opportunity. So you can use the same fencing method underneath that to keep the animal out. You want to bury some of it. You want to dig out like 6 to 12 inches away from the fence and put chicken wire down so they can't dig underneath it. And this will prevent any animal from entering that area, not just a coyote. Just important to note, you want to make sure that no animal is underneath that area when you put up this fence, because any animal that's inside that will also not be able to get out. And not only will that be a terrible way for the animal to die, but it'll also be a very terrible smell, especially during the summer, because no one likes the smell of rotting animals. A lot of questions we get are, why can't you trap the coyotes, especially on LBI? People want us to trap the coyotes and remove them and bring them to the pine barrens. And while that seems like a very good idea, people assume the coyote would be happier in the pine barrens where it has a lot more open space. Generally, you can't really do this for a multitude of reasons, but first of all, a coyote would just repopulate the area. If you took the coyotes out of Holgate or out of Barnegat Light, another coyote from the mainland would find its way out there and repopulate the area, and it would really do nothing. Another reason is it's just very inhumane. Survival rates of any wildlife that is trapped and relocated is low. This is also for a multitude of reasons, but mostly it's for the reason that they're in a new home range. They've spent their entire life learning a very small area of the world where they're very comfortable finding food, finding shelter, finding a mate, and then you drop them into a new area where they don't know how to do any of that, and now they're expected to live, and they're probably going to get hit by a car very quickly. On top of that, most of the areas in New Jersey that we would consider wildlife friendly are already up to capacity with wildlife. So if you dropped a coyote into the middle of the pine barrens, you're probably dropping it into an area that is already territory for either another coyote or another red fox. And now that new coyote has to spend a lot of energy and time trying to fight for territory. And I mean fight in the most literal sense. They can come into conflict with the red fox or the coyote of that area and actually fight to the death over that area. So when you move an animal from one area to another, it usually ends with the death of at least one animal. So that's why we can't move animals. The last reason being it spreads disease. It would cost a lot of money to check every animal that we would have to trap and relocate for things like mange and canine distemper. And it'd be really irresponsible of us to move a coyote from LBI or any of the other coastal areas inland to the pine barrens if we didn't check for disease, because bringing something like that into an area can really disrupt the population and kind of collapse it. So removal is best only if there's an immediate and obvious threat to human safety. And in that case, we do have to humanely euthanize the animal. It's really the only humane thing to do, because if you try to remove it and put it somewhere else, it's just going to die a slow, painful death rather than a quick and painless one. So we've recommended that that's really the only way to remove these animals, unfortunately. And we try to reduce the amount of removal we need to do as much as possible for that reason. And then lastly, encountering an aggressive coyote is extremely rare. Signs of aggression are similar to that of aggressive domestic dog: snarling, growling, lunging. If this is occurring in your area or around your area, call the police or animal control immediately. That coyote might be unwell. This is a picture of an aggressive coyote in North Carolina that they had to put down. It was attacking car headlights. It tested positive for rabies. Rabies is extremely rare in the canine population here in New Jersey. Rabies is way more prevalent in things like bats and raccoons. Red foxes and coyotes do not have rabies that often. There was that case with a red fox a few weeks back in Jackson that unfortunately bit that little girl. It had rabies, but that is an extremely rare case. And coyotes generally don't get rabies that often, and they will not attack. But if you are attacked by a coyote, try to remember they're about 35 pounds. It's like a fat Cocker Spaniel. So try to kick it, punch it. It'll eventually leave because you're bigger and stronger than it, and you really can't do any damage to you. And then just one last slide. Coyotes in New Jersey are here to stay. there have been a lot of efforts in a lot of different parts of the world to remove coyotes from an area, and due to their crazy ability to reproduce very quickly and their ability to live off of all kinds of different food items, they are pretty much impossible to remove, except for releasing some kind of disease out in the landscape, which is completely irresponsible. So they're here to stay, and we just kind of have to learn how to live with them. And they can be pretty beneficial, as I mentioned. They can really help control rodent and rabbit populations that can be pretty problematic in an area. And hopefully they can be pretty helpful at controlling those mesopredator populations and reducing the pressure on prey species in an area. This is another great picture of a blonde coyote. This was taken in the eco preserve on the Rutgers campus. And yeah, I have to plug our coyote fact sheet on our website. If you Google Rutgers wildlife and coyote, it'll pop up on Google. It pretty much has everything I've talked about today written down in a pretty well summarized article. And it has all our contact information on it if you have any questions. Here are our contact information. Kathleen Kerwin, she's our lab manager. You can reach out to her with questions. You can also reach out to me. There's my email there. And if there are any questions from any part of the presentation, I'd be happy to answer. And thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. I'm going to clap for you. The whole clapping thing in the virtual environment is not as fun as it is in person, but that was wonderful, so informative. And you're obviously a tremendous speaker. So anybody have any questions for Chris?
Thanks.
Yes, hi, Chris. If you could just repeat, you had mentioned that there was a time frame when the youth are kind of kicked out of the nest there. What was that time frame again?
It's around the time we are in right now. So it's pretty much mid-August to mid to late September. They're going to start kicking them out. They're going to be big. All the coyotes that were born earlier this year are now fully grown. They're going to look no different to us than a regular full-grown coyote. And so the parents are going to start kicking them out because there's not enough resources to go around. So you're going to see more coyotes popping up in backyards, not knowing what they're doing.
In the cemetery.
Any other questions for Chris before we end today's event?
I have a question.
Sure.
With the young coyotes, if, once they get kicked out and they're sort of wandering around somewhat trying to figure things out, would that make them aggressive or would that make them more shy?
Each coyote is going to be an individual. We like to talk about groups of animals as their groups of animals, but each coyote is going to be individual. They're not going to be necessarily more aggressive because they're lost. They're just trying to find an area that can have enough food for them. So they're not, the difference between aggressive and shy is more up to the individual's genetic makeup than anything else. But they will be maybe a little bit more bold in trying to find food if they are very hungry.
Right.
Be perceived as aggressive if you don't know what's going on with the animal.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question. Good question.
I have one.
Yeah.
I was out west in New Mexico and heard what I was told was coyotes howling. Do the coyotes in New Jersey howl as well?
They do, yeah. I've not heard it in person, but it's more of I think yapping or yowling. It's a mix between, I don't know if you've ever heard a red fox vocalize, but they kind of just scream. It sounds like a blood curdling scream. It's a mixture between that and what you would expect from a wolf. It's kind of high pitched yowling or yapping.
Okay.
But they do vocalize. Yes, they do.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, anybody else?
Chris,
Yeah.
Living on the Barrier Island, we often see deer swimming across the bay. Do coyotes ever swim distances like that?
They do. We don't have any formal record of that occurring here in New Jersey, but that does occur in other parts of the world. And it's more likely that they're doing something called island hopping, where they're hopping They're swimming shorter distances to smaller islands that we don't necessarily think of because they're not habitable by humans, but it's big enough for a coyote to take a rest on for an afternoon and then get back in the water and swim across as well. There's that island just south of LBI called Little Beach that has no human population on it. And there's a pretty constant population of red foxes on that island. And every year the US Department of Agriculture goes out there and tries to remove as many red foxes as they can from the island for the bird population. And every year red foxes come back. And we're pretty sure they're either swimming or walking through the back marsh on that low tide to get out there. The bay hasn't frozen in a few years, so that's probably not what's happening. So they're definitely swimming out there. Again, we don't have any record of that happening on LBI for coyotes. I assume they probably just walked over the bridge on 72, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. That's what they do. And yeah, that's probably what's happening, more than likely.
Thank you.
But they do swim, definitely. Good question. Thanks, Brian.
Anybody else? Chris is a pro. No one seems to be able to stump him, so keep coming. Okay. Well, if you enjoyed today's program, please let your friends know. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel for playback. And we hope to see all of you in September for our next talk on slavery in New Jersey. So thank you again, Chris.
Thank you.
And Barb, is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off for the day?
No, I'm very appreciative.
Okay,
Thanks for having me, and thanks to Brian for setting this up.
Yes.
great. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.